It's somewhat surprising that Wolfenstein, a series which arguably gave us the first stealth games, as well as providing us with one of the earliest first-person shooters, is still alive and kicking some 36 years later after it began. The fact that it's an ongoing brand with such a lengthy history, while also having a quality track record behind it, is even more impressive. With 6 mainline entries, 2 official expansions, a spin-off or 2, and a brand new release set for the fall of 2017, the general consistency is nothing to take for granted. Before the release of the new Colossus at this year's end, I felt like revisiting the FPS entries of the Wolfenstein series, to reacquaint myself with them and see how they stack in comparison with one another. We'll start with Wolfenstein 3D, then move on to Return to Castle Wolfenstein, Wolfenstein 2009, The New Order, The Old Blood, and we'll conclude by getting an impression of the new Colossus and ranking the games against one another. I won't be reviewing the first 2 games of the series, those being Castle Wolfenstein and Beyond Castle Wolfenstein, for a couple reasons. I haven't played either of these 2 as of yet, for starters, and it would be strange to rank 2 top-down stealth games in relation to a group of first-person shooters that primarily focus on action. Primarily, at least. So, with that preamble out of the way, let's briefly look at the creation and content of Wolfenstein 3D. Published and developed by Muse Software and designed by Silas Warner in 1981, Castle Wolfenstein and its 1984 sequel Beyond Castle Wolfenstein were top-down stealth games which arguably invented said genre. They were both available for the Apple II, Commodore 64, and MS-DOS, and while popular for their respective systems, Muse was having financial issues regardless and went belly up in 1986. This led to the trademark for Wolfenstein becoming lapsed and remaining dormant for some time afterward. Dormant until young id Software, having already made the Commander Keen side-scroller games, as well as 2 early first-person shooters, Hover Tank 3D and Catacombs 3D, got the idea to attempt to remake Castle Wolfenstein in this 3D engine. With the final Commander Keen game having been a relative success, they got the funding they needed to make this game a reality. Now obviously this is a skimmed, poor, and extremely abridged history of Wolfenstein 3D's development. If you are interested in the subject, I'd recommend watching the Gaming Historians series on the history of Wolfenstein, specifically Part 1, which discusses Muse, Silas Warner, and how id Software got the rights to begin with. It's an incredibly well done series. The player is put into the role of B.J. Blazkowicz, U.S. Army Ranger and burly manly man who escapes imprisonment at the hands of the Third Reich, attacks Nazi bioweapons facilities, attempts to obtain the Spear of Destiny, goes to hell, and takes the fight to Hitler himself, among other adventures. No matter the background and context of the episode in question, 9 of which being developed by id Software, being split between the main game, the Nocturnal missions, and the expansion Spear of Destiny, the player finds themselves exploring maze-like levels, shooting Nazis, and collecting treasure like the kleptomaniac they are. Wolfenstein 3D has 4 weapons to choose from, being a knife, a pistol, a submachine gun, and a chain gun. The biggest difference between the 3 firearms isn't about their damage output, but the rate at which they fire. They all do the same amount of damage, or at least have very similar damage numbers, with each subsequent weapon firing significantly faster than the last. This, for the time the game was released, was a good selection to choose from, even if the different firearms just boiled down to firing faster than the one prior. Enemy variety is solid as well. The Rogues Gallery features 6 enemies, with their own unique strengths and shortcomings. Dogs are fast, but can only do low damage attacks at point blank range. The regular brown Nazi guards do a decent amount of damage unless firing from point blank or from behind, which is far more powerful. The blue SS have the highest damage and the fastest attack rate. White officers, who for the most part do damage akin to the guards, have a much faster movement speed than any other enemy in the game. The mutants, and the identical bats from Spear of Destiny, act like the SS but have a slightly higher movement speed. And finally, the Hitler Ghosts are slow, but throw out highly damaging projectiles. This is all on top of boss fights at the end of each episode, although the majority of the bosses are rather similar to one another. The AI, although incredibly basic in hindsight, was also a fairly impressive feat for its day. With enemies being mobile enough to pose a threat, especially on higher difficulties, and performing interesting actions such as opening doors on their own. Again, very basic in hindsight, but it's impressive to think about, even if my praise of the enemy AI can also be attributed to the level design masking their shortcomings. It's also interesting to look at Wolfenstein 3D in retrospect, compared to Doom and Quake in particular. What makes it hold its own against its younger brethren is how tense it can be compared to the more bombastic id Software alternatives. There is no armor system in place to absorb some of the damage the player takes, and even the run-of-the-mill Nazi guard can potentially take out half the player's health in a single shot. Groups of enemies can simply ventilate you if you're not careful, even being able to shoot through one another to damage the player, and some are placed on either side of a doorway just to get that ambush shot on you. The only way to avoid getting completely overwhelmed on the normal and hard difficulties, bring them on and I am Death Incarnate respectively, is to check those corners and keep it tight. The fact that death can come so quickly in Wolfenstein 3D is something that elevates the combat to be tight, fast, and still relatively enjoyable, despite its age. And its high stakes, high tension style is something not often replicated by its contemporaries. I've done nothing but praise the game up to this point, and while I'd love to keep talking up the positive aspects, Wolfenstein 3D is a flawed title with a number of off-putting details. The labyrinthine level design can be a tad frustrating at times to navigate, with layouts being mazes and corridors looking remarkably similar to one another. Considering one may need to do a bit of backtracking throughout levels while locating one or two keys to reach the level exit elevator, memorizing and making a mental map of the levels can be a bit of a pain. It is theoretically possible to mark your path, however, by paying attention to the collection of items that you leave around untouched to mark your path up to that point, or more reliably, you can work with the old mantra of, if you see enemy corpses, you've been there already. This is mutual between both Wolfenstein 3D and its successor Doom, although the latter generally lack the level design issues of the former. I mentioned earlier how enemies can be placed beside doorways to get a surprise attack on the player, which on its own isn't necessarily a bad thing. After all, I praise the tension that this can bring to the combat, but enemy placement like that, along with a few other issues, can put a damper on it. For instance, enemies can shoot through other enemies while they're in clusters, which is a bit unfair, and placing enemies beside door frames and other choke points like that, opposing hallways, dead-end proto-monster closets, etc., while mixed with somewhat slippery movement controls, can lead to some potential frustration. These can be written off as growing pains of the FPS genre at the time, but excusable issues are still issues nonetheless. And there's no getting around the fact that Wolfenstein 3D does show its age, which is impossible to avoid for such an early effort. The only genuine flaw I have with the data mechanics would be the game's inclusion of an arbitrary life system, a mechanic that works well for stretching out arcade games, but is counterintuitive for a home PC release like this. Beyond that, others may have an issue with the lack of verticality to the levels, the somewhat clunky controls as mentioned earlier, how bosses are essentially just a stronger version of average enemies, and so on. It's the kind of thing you have to go in being aware of, and if one does that, they shouldn't have an issue. At the end of it all, I'm honestly very surprised that Wolfenstein 3D, one of the earliest first-person shooters that turned 25 years old in 2017, holds up as well as it does. It's enjoyable from a mechanical standpoint, and has an interesting take on first-person action that its successors by id Software wouldn't attempt. Wolfenstein 3D remains an important part of gaming history, and is arguably the springboard which popularized the FPS genre and allowed it to move on to bigger and better things. As we'll see next time, the Wolfenstein franchise would go on to do the same itself.